The coin sack landed on the saloon table with a dull, heavy thud that cut through the haze of cheap whiskey and sweat. It was small, made of worn leather, and held the entire sum of Mylene's worth. Her stepfather, Bill Corrigan, did not look at her. His attention was fixed on the man across the table, a lone rancher whose name she had not caught. The rancher's eyes, however, were on her. They were a pale, washed-out blue, the color of a winter sky, and they missed nothing. "She's a hard worker," Corrigan slurred, shoving the sack closer to the man's hand. "Strong back. And quiet. Won't give you no trouble." He finally turned his bloodshot gaze on Mylene, who stood by the door, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Her expression was a careful blank, a mask she had perfected over 6 long years. "She's deaf, take her." The words echoed in the sudden quiet of the saloon. A few prospectors lowered their cards to stare. Mylene felt the familiar burn of shame creep up her neck, but she did not flinch. She kept her eyes on a knot in the floorboards, letting the world believe she had heard nothing. It was her armor, this silence. A fortress built of stillness. The rancher, Arthur Vance, looked from Corrigan's eager, bloated face back to Mylene. He was not a large man, but there was a solidity to him, a sense of being rooted to the ground he stood on. His clothes were worn but clean, his hands calloused from work, not from brawling. He rose slowly from the table, his chair scraping against the rough floor. He picked up the sack of gold coins without counting them and tucked it into Corrigan's shirt pocket. "The deal is made," Arthur said, his voice low and even, carrying no more emotion than the dust motes dancing in the afternoon sunbeams. Corrigan grinned, a foul sight of yellowed teeth. "Good man. She's yours now." He turned to leave, already thinking of the bottles that gold would buy, not even offering a backward glance. He had taken her mother's last few dollars, then her dignity, and now he had sold her last possession, herself. Arthur Vance walked toward her. Mylene braced herself, expecting a rough hand on her arm, a shove toward the door. Instead, he stopped a few feet away. He simply nodded toward the street, a gesture for her to precede him. She obeyed, walking out of the saloon and into the blistering heat of the Nevada summer. The sun was a hammer, the dust a fine powder that coated everything. His wagon was waiting, a sturdy buckboard with a single, patient horse hitched to it. A few sacks of flour and salt were tied down in the back. It was the wagon of a man who lived a life stripped down to necessities. He gestured for her to climb up onto the seat, and she did, her movement stiff. He loaded the small bundle of her belongings, 2 worn dresses and her mother's jade pendant wrapped in a handkerchief, into the back, then climbed up beside her. The journey was made in silence. The town of Redemption, with its false-fronted buildings and broken promises, shrank behind them. They traveled east, into a landscape of sagebrush and stark, sun-baked hills. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon wheels and the steady clop of the horse's hooves. Mylene kept her gaze fixed on the horizon, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. She felt Arthur's eyes on her from time to time, but he made no attempt to speak, no attempt to gesture. She had built her silent world out of necessity. After her father, a proud man who had come from across the great ocean to help lay the iron tracks of the railroad, had died in a rockslide, her mother had been left with nothing. Marrying Bill Corrigan, a failed prospector with a small, useless claim, had seemed like the only way to survive. But survival had come at a cost. After her mother succumbed to a fever 2 years later, Corrigan's bitterness had found a new target. His words had been sharp, his temper explosive. The day he had raised a hand to her, she had discovered her shield. She had simply stopped responding, stopped hearing. His rage, when met with a wall of uncomprehending silence, eventually burned itself out. Deafness became her refuge. Now, that refuge had become a cage, sold to a stranger. She studied the man beside her from the corner of her eye. His profile was weathered, carved by sun and wind. He held the reins with a loose, confident grip. He did not seem cruel. He did not seem anything. He was a blank slate, and that was more frightening than Corrigan's predictable malice. They rode for hours. The sun began to dip, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple. Just when she thought the vast, empty land would go on forever, he turned the wagon onto a barely visible track that led toward a small cluster of cottonwood trees. Nestled within them was a cabin. It was small and stark, built of rough-hewn timber with a stone chimney and a simple porch. A corral stood nearby, holding for head of cattle and 2 horses. A well-tended vegetable patch fought a brave battle against the dry soil. It was a place of solitude, of hard and lonely work. Arthur pulled the wagon to a halt and climbed down. He walked to her side of the buckboard and looked up at her. He made no move to help her, just waited. She swung herself down, her legs stiff from the long ride. He took her small bundle from the back and led the way to the cabin. The inside was one room, meticulously clean. A bed was in one corner, a stone hearth in another. A simple table and 2 chairs stood in the center. A shelf held a few books, their spines worn. He placed her bundle on the bed. Then he turned to her and gestured toward the room, a sweeping motion with his hand, as if to say, "This is it." He pointed to the water pump by the sink, then to the shelves where plates and tins were stored. He was trying to communicate, to make her understand. She nodded, keeping her face placid, playing the part she had been assigned. He cooked a simple meal of bacon and beans, and they ate in silence at the table. The quiet in the cabin was different from the quiet in Corrigan's shack. There, silence had been a weapon, a tense waiting for the next explosion. Here, it was a natural part of the landscape, as vast and deep as the night sky outside. When they were finished, he took her plate and washed it with his own. He then unrolled a bedroll and placed it on the floor near the hearth. He pointed to the bed, then to himself and the bedroll. The bed was for her. A flicker of surprise went through her. It was the first act of consideration, however small, she had received in years. She gave another slow nod and watched as he settled onto the floor, turning his back to her before blowing out the single lantern. The room plunged into darkness, filled only with the sound of the wind whispering through the cottonwoods. Lying in the unfamiliar bed, which smelled faintly of pine soap and sun-dried linen, Mylene did not sleep. She listened to the breathing of the stranger on the floor, and for the first time in a very long time, she felt a sliver of something that was not fear. It was a fragile, unnerving curiosity. She did not yet know that the silence he offered was not one of ignorance, but one of patience. The first week established a rhythm. They rose with the sun and worked until it set. Arthur never demanded anything of her. He would simply begin a task, and she would watch, then find a way to help. She mended his clothes, tended the garden, and learned to milk their single cow. He repaired fences, chopped wood, and cared for the livestock. They moved around each other in a silent ballet of shared labor. He would communicate with simple gestures, and she would respond with quiet efficiency. She watched him constantly. He was a man of deliberate movements and immense patience. When a calf got tangled in a wire fence, he spent over an hour calming it, speaking to it in a low murmur, his hands gentle as he worked the wire free. He treated his animals with a respect he had not yet shown her, but he also hadn't shown her any disrespect. He was simply waiting. The summer heat intensified, baking the land until it cracked. The creek that watered his small pasture slowed to a trickle. One afternoon, the sky turned a bruised, sickly yellow. The air grew heavy and still. Arthur stood on the porch, staring at the horizon. He came inside and made a sharp, downward motion with his hand, a sign to stay put, before grabbing a shovel and an axe and heading for the low ground near the creek. Mylene understood. A storm was coming, a summer gully washer that could turn the dry creek bed into a raging torrent in minutes. His cattle were in the lowest part of the pasture. She watched from the window as he worked alone, trying to dig a shallow trench to divert the worst of a potential flash flood away from the corral. The first drops of rain were fat and heavy, hitting the tin roof like thrown pebbles. Then the sky opened. Rain fell in a solid, blinding sheet. Wind tore at the cottonwoods. Within minutes, the creek was a churning brown monster, spilling its banks. She saw Arthur struggling, ankle-deep, then knee-deep in the rising water. The cattle were panicking, lowing in terror. A large log, carried by the current, slammed into a section of the corral fence, and the wood splintered with a loud crack. He had told her to stay inside. But she could not stand by and watch his livelihood, their livelihood, be washed away. She pulled on his spare oilskin slicker, which hung by the door, and ran out into the storm. The force of the wind and rain stole her breath. The ground was slick with mud. She reached the corral just as two of the panicked steers broke through the damaged fence and headed for the raging creek. Arthur shouted something lost to the wind and scrambled after them. He was going to lose them, or worse, be swept away himself. Without thinking, Mylene ran upstream. She remembered something her father had told her about how to turn a herd. You don't go at them head-on. You create a barrier they won't want to cross. She grabbed a long, fallen branch and, using all her strength, dragged it into the shallow, fast-moving water ahead of the escaping cattle. She splashed and yelled, her voice raw and unfamiliar in her own ears, a sound swallowed by the storm. She was no longer the silent, deaf girl. She was a force against the flood. The steers saw the commotion in the water ahead of them and veered away, back toward the higher ground of the pasture. Arthur, seeing what she had done, worked his way toward her. He grabbed her arm, his grip firm but not painful, and pulled her toward the relative safety of the barn. Just as they reached it, a sound like thunder split the air, but it wasn't the storm. A massive cottonwood tree, its roots loosened by the floodwater, crashed down exactly where they had been standing moments before. Mylene had reacted to the groaning, tearing sound of the tree's roots giving way a split second before it fell. She had stumbled back, pulling on his arm, her eyes wide with a terror that had nothing to do with feigned deafness. Inside the barn, dripping and gasping for breath, the roar of the storm was slightly muffled. They stood in the hay-scented dimness, the panicked animals shifting around them. Arthur did not let go of her arm. He looked down at her, his pale eyes searching her face. He had seen it. He had seen her react to the sound of the splintering fence, had heard her shout at the cattle, had felt her pull him away from the falling tree. He did not say a word. He just held her gaze for a long moment. The question was there, clear as any spoken word. He knew. But he let the moment pass. He released her arm and turned to calm the horses. The surface conflict was over, the cattle were safe for now. But a much deeper tension had just broken the surface, as surely as the creek had broken its banks. The silence between them was no longer a simple absence of words. It was now filled with a truth that had not yet been spoken. That evening, the storm passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and smelling of wet earth and sage. The floodwaters receded as quickly as they had risen, leaving a mess of mud and debris. They worked for 2 hours by lantern light, reinforcing the broken fence enough to last the night. Back in the cabin, the air was thick with unspoken things. Arthur stoked the fire while Mylene made coffee. She moved with a new tension, an awareness that her fortress had been breached. She could feel his eyes on her, not with suspicion, but with a quiet, waiting intensity. She set 2 mugs on the table and sat down, her hands wrapped around the warm ceramic. He sat across from her. He did not look at her, but at the fire, its light flickering across his weathered face. For a long time, the only sounds were the crackle of the flames and the drip of water from the eaves. Then he spoke. His voice was low, matter-of-fact. The big cottonwood. The roots groaned for a second before they let go. You pulled back before I even knew what was happening. Mylene's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. The moment of reckoning. She could lie, shake her head, try to mime some explanation. But she was tired of the lie. It was a heavy cloak, and she had worn it for too long. She looked at her hands, then slowly, she met his gaze across the table. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Arthur's expression did not change. He took a slow sip of his coffee. How long? He asked, his voice still quiet. Her own voice, when it came, was a surprise. It was rough, a little hoarse from disuse. 6 years. He nodded, as if this confirmed something he had long suspected. Corrigan. Yes, the single word was freighted with a whole history of fear and survival. She found herself telling him, the words coming in a slow, careful trickle at first, then flowing more easily. She told him about her father, about her mother's desperation, about Corrigan's cruelty. She told him how the silence had been a shield, a small patch of ground she could control when everything else was chaos. She spoke of the loneliness of it, the way the world had flattened into a series of images without sound. As she spoke, she reached into the bodice of her dress and pulled out the jade pendant. It was a simple, smooth disc of pale green, cool to the touch. "This was my mother's," she said, laying it on the rough wood of the table between them. "It is the only thing I have left of my family." He tried to take it once. "That was the day I stopped hearing." Arthur looked at the pendant, then back at her face. Something in his expression softened, a loosening of the hard lines around his eyes. "A man like that," he said, his voice laced with a cold, quiet anger, "he doesn't deserve to have power over anyone." He reached across the table, but he did not touch the pendant. His fingers gently brushed against hers. It was a brief, simple contact, but it felt like a seismic event. It was an acknowledgement. An acceptance. He knew her secret, and he was not angry. He did not feel cheated. In his eyes, she saw not pity, but a deep, resonant understanding. The peace of that moment was shattered 3 days later. A rider appeared on the horizon, moving with the unsteady gait of a man who was no stranger to a bottle, even in the morning. It was Bill Corrigan. He rode straight into the yard and dismounted, leaving his horse untethered. He had spent all the gold. His clothes were dirtier, his eyes more frantic. He swaggered toward the porch where Arthur was mending a piece of tack. Mylene, who had been weeding the garden, froze. "Vance," Corrigan called out, his voice loud and abrasive in the quiet air. "We need to talk." Arthur slowly set down his tools and stood up. "I've got nothing to say to you, Corrigan." "Oh, I think you do," he sneered, his eyes darting to Mylene and then around the small ranch. "Heard in town your creek never runs dry. A man with a water source like that, on a claim this size, he's sitting on a fortune." He took a step closer. "That little sack of coins was a down payment. A lease, you might say. For her," he jerked his chin toward Mylene. "And for a piece of this operation." "The deal was for her hand," Arthur said, his voice dangerously low. "The deal is done. You are not welcome here." Corrigan laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "She ain't got a say in it. She's a deaf mute. Legally, our contract ain't valid without a proper witness from the territory. I could have it annulled." "Take her back." He looked directly at Mylene, his expression turning cruel. "Or maybe I'll just tell the marshal you're holding a defective woman against her will." It was the ultimate trap. Her silence, her shield, was now the weapon he would use against them. If she remained deaf, he could claim the contract was invalid. He could tie them up in legal trouble they couldn't afford, or worse, drag her back into his control. Corrigan took another step, reaching a grimy hand out toward her. "Come on, girl. We're leaving." Arthur moved, placing himself between them. "You will not touch her." But Mylene knew this couldn't be solved by Arthur's strength. It had to be solved by her. This was her battle. She took a deep breath, the dry, dusty air searing her lungs. She stepped out from behind Arthur, planting her feet in the soil of her garden. She looked directly into Bill Corrigan's stunned, hateful face. Her voice was not a whisper this time. It was clear, strong, and it rang out across the yard with the force of a bell. "My name is Mylene," she said, the words tasting of freedom. "And this is my home. You have no claim on me. You have no claim on this land. Leave now, or I will be the one to speak to the marshal." Corrigan stared, his jaw slack. He looked from her to Arthur and back again, his whiskey-soaked mind struggling to comprehend. He saw not a deaf, broken creature, but a woman standing her ground. A woman with a voice. The power he had held over her for 6 years evaporated in that single moment of defiance. Rage contorted his features. He lunged, not at Arthur, but at her. But Arthur was ready. He didn't throw a punch. He simply caught Corrigan's arm, using the man's own momentum to spin him around and send him sprawling into the dust. "Get off my land," Arthur said, his voice flat and final. Scrambling to his feet, humiliated and defeated, Corrigan spat on the ground. He glared at Mylene with pure hatred. "You'll regret this," he snarled, before climbing onto his horse and riding away, a pathetic figure disappearing into the vast indifference of the landscape. Mylene stood trembling, the adrenaline slowly draining away. She had spoken. She had faced him. She had chosen her ground. Arthur came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything, but his presence was a solid, comforting anchor. He had given her a refuge, and in it, she had found her voice. For months later, the relentless heat of summer had softened into the golden light of autumn. The cottonwood leaves were turning, and a crispness touched the morning air. The ranch was transformed. The vegetable garden had yielded a small but vital harvest, now stored for the winter. The corral fence was strong and secure, and a new lean-to had been added to the barn. They had acquired 6 more head of cattle, a small investment in a future they were building together. They had worked side by side, day in and day out. Their silence now was one of comfort and easy companionship. They spoke when words were needed, but more often, they understood each other through a shared glance, a nod, a simple gesture. Mylene's voice, once a rusted tool, had found its rhythm. She would sometimes sing softly to herself while working in the garden, old songs her mother had taught her. Arthur would often pause in his work, listening, a small, quiet smile touching his lips. Corrigan had not returned. A month after the confrontation, Arthur had taken a 2-day ride to the territorial office in Carson City. He didn't say why he was going. When he returned, he was quiet, but a tension had left his shoulders. A week later, they heard from a traveling freighter that Bill Corrigan had been run out of redemption on a warrant for claim jumping and fraud dating back 3 years. His power, built on bullying and lies, had been a hollow shell. One evening, as the sun set, they sat on the porch steps, watching the hills fade to purple silhouettes. The day's work was done. Arthur had been quiet all afternoon, with a thoughtful air about him. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a legal document, a land deed from the territorial office. He unfolded it and handed it to her. She read the neatly printed script under the fading light. It was the official deed to the homestead, the 320 acres of land, the cabin, the well, and the future. And at the bottom, 2 names were listed as proprietors, Arthur Vance and Mylene Vance. Her breath caught in her throat. She looked up at him, her eyes shining. He had not just cleared her of Corrigan. He had made her his partner, in name and in law. He had given her a stake in the land, a permanence she had never imagined possible. "It's ours," he said simply, his pale blue eyes meeting hers. "A place to stand." She traced her name on the paper, the letters a firm, undeniable claim. The paper was solid in her hands. She thought of the small sack of coins that had bought her, a transaction of shame in a dusty saloon. It felt like a lifetime ago. That was a sale. This, she realized, was a promise. Home was not a place you were taken to. It was a place you built, with your hands and your heart. And with a voice you had thought was lost forever. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.